Welcome to my presentation on the open source glass is half full, a perspective on digital sovereignty in Switzerland. My name is Matthias Stürmer. I'm head of the Institute for Public Sector Transformation and professor at the Bern University of Applied Sciences. My background is technical, but also business administration, and also I'm involved in different activities all around open source in Switzerland. In the background, we are a big team of over 60 members, which actually contribute and research and teach all around technology, law, legal procurement issues, and political aspects. So our research areas are very broad, around 30 topics we address in our team. Today, I'm going to focus on open source software and digital sovereignty. First, I'm going to show you a brief overview on the history and the current situation in open source in Switzerland. Second, I'm showing you the in-depth discussion on digital sovereignty in Switzerland. And finally, I'm presenting you some suggestions on how can we actually improve the situation. Open source software in Switzerland actually has a long history. Since over 20 years now, open source is a topic in Swiss government. Exactly 20 years ago, the Swiss government actually released a strategy on supporting open source software, in actually increasing the use of open source and participating in the community. However, in implementing open source and the migration to open source software actually showed that it is quite difficult to switch from proprietary platforms to open source. For example, the canton of Solothurn, they tried to migrate to Linux, and however they failed, and the head of the IT unit had to leave the government. It actually shows that nobody has ever been fired for buying Microsoft, and so it's much easier to actually go mainstream with the proprietary vendors. A similar situation happened in the Bern schools, where actually I was also involved and supported the political push towards open source. However, the project's management was badly implemented and they failed in actually the technical implementation. So therefore, there was another failure of open source in Switzerland with this example in the school in Bern. Nevertheless, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the quantity of how much open source is being used by the companies, we show that actually almost everybody uses open source software. On our 3-year open source study, we showed that 96.6% of the people of the companies and governments, they actually use open source in the one or the other direction. Now, using open source is one thing. However, actually releasing open source underneath open source licenses is another option. So you have heard the claim of public money, public code, and this actually shows on how governments can actually contribute to open source development. In Switzerland, the political push towards the release of open source software is actually over 16 years old, because the political group of ParDigi, the Parliamentarian Group for Digital Sustainability, was founded in 2009. The group actually supports the use of open source software and open data and open access and lots of different open technologies and standards in Switzerland. And the good thing is it's completely party independent. It's from the left wing to the right wing parties. They have representatives in our group, and they have really a strong position on pushing open source and open knowledge. So that's also one of the reasons why this new law regarding open source software is actually now have been implemented and enacted since January 2024. This federal act on the use of electronic means to carry out official tasks actually includes an obligation, a clear requirement for the federal government to release open source software whenever they have a piece of code they own. So whenever federal government nowadays actually develops software, or actually IT providers contribute individual software solutions, there's an obligation to release the software unless there actually are third-party rights included. So if this is proprietary software, they don't have the right to release it as open source. And if there are security reasons. So for example, if there is the police which has some secret software to create some kind of security in Switzerland, they are not allowed to actually release this kind of security related software. But nevertheless, most software development should be able to release as open source software. There's a recent publication by our colleague Rika Koch, this new Swiss open source software obligation law in regard to public procurement. So they explain why also, especially in IT procurement, this new law plays an important role. We actually presented this new law, the Swiss embark law, in 2024 at the FOSDEM conference in Brussels. And this was the first time this new law was shown and then presented on an international level. And actually, we also informed the European Commission, also the open source observatory about the new law. We published a report, and then actually news media, they took it up. Satinet, for example, they created a report about this. Switzerland federal government requires releasing its software as open source. And even a YouTuber created a video on with thousands of views about this new Swiss law. And then there was the internet, the social media, which looked at it, Twitter or nowadays X, they actually looked at it, and even Jack Dorsey and Elon Musk had a like for the Swiss MBAG law. It shows that there is quite some attention on this new law, and that now we are going to look into the future on how the Swiss government implements this new requirement. This actually already was being done in several occasions. For example, the Swiss Army, the Swiss Cyber Command, they released the software Loom, a data analytics platform, as open source software on their GitLab account, and which was also reported on the open source directory. So have a look at these new government released open source software. Then there is actually a clear position by the Swiss government regarding the priority of open source in the Swiss IT and digitalization area. So here, this year, open source is one of the 3 core topics of the Swiss IT government. And therefore, the government, the federal authorities, they say that open source contributes through the increase of transparency, security, and innovation, and strengthens thus digital sovereignty. There is lots of open source releases happening. So, for example, government on the national and regional level, they release open source as it can be seen in the open source benchmark. And so we actually crawl every day the GitHub repositories, and therefore there are over 220 institutions, companies, which actually already release open source software since many years. There's also success stories on the release and collaboration within open source software. For example, the Swiss COVID certificate, this QR generating app, actually this was developed by the Swiss government, and they released it as open source to increase trust in the technology. Then actually the Austrian government took it up. They used it for their COVID app, and then actually they contributed back bug reports, bug fixes, and also new features. The other example is the workflow software Kaluma and the Inosco community. Here, 6 cantons in Switzerland collaborate in software development as open source software. And finally, there is the Open Rail Association, a railway software community founded by national authorities and national railway organizations from all over Europe, and they actually collaborate in development of software in the railway sector. So these examples show how open source collaboration is taking place nowadays, coordinated also in Switzerland. The use of open source in the government is now also piloted. So actually the alternative to Microsoft M365, the OpenDesk solution from Germany, is now being implemented also in the Swiss government. So there's a pilot project going on by the Swiss Federal Chancellery on implementing this proof of concept. So after this overview of open source software, now let's have a look at the discussion on digital sovereignty in Switzerland. So the Swiss government, in fact, is a little bit slow. In Europe, many governments in France, in Germany, in Austria, they actually had addressed this topic of digital sovereignty since many years, since over 10 years. Governments all over Europe are looking into this topic. Nevertheless, in Switzerland, only the last 3 or 4 years, the government actually identified this as a hot topic, and now is being looking into it. The president Gassis he invited to a meeting 3 years ago, and he addressed this topic. And in this way, also the Swiss government now actually forces to create a strategy on digital sovereignty. We at the Bern University of Applied Sciences, we published a report last year on the technological perspective on digital sovereignty. So we looked at the vendor lock-in situation and how this can be decreased by using open source software. or we actually addressed in this report the trade-off between public cloud computing and digital sovereignty. Although the study is in German, please have a look at it. Maybe you can translate certain parts in English. So in this study, we actually address the topic of digital sovereignty by identifying 4 pillars of technological autonomy. So we say the basis is the regulation, the laws and the standards, but then actually the 4 different technological pillars, ICT, infrastructure, software, data, and artificial intelligence, they build the foundation of digital sovereignty. Nevertheless, it's important to have the technical skills, to have employees which actually manage these technologies, which can use the technology together with science and civil society to create innovative products, create innovation and implementation by the government and in industry. Now, the political situation is clearly towards digital sovereignty. So there are lots of parliamentarians in Switzerland, on the national level and the local level, which demand for the increase of digital sovereignty. So politicians from the left to the right wing actually say that the government has to increase and to strengthen digital sovereignty and to really implement it with specific activities. For example, here some pushes towards a policy request on digital sovereignty. One specific example on how the Swiss scientific community pushes towards digital sovereignty in the artificial intelligence area is the development of a new open source large language model. This model is being trained on public data, which is also released, and also the software and the weights are being released by the 3 stakeholders, the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, the EPFL, and the Swiss National Supercomputing Center. So with the training of this ALPS infrastructure, over 10,000 NVIDIA GPUs, it is able to create a new open language model, and this actually also decreases the dependency on hyperscaler proprietary AI. Also, we created a network on digital sovereignty called Sovereign Digital Switzerland, and this network actually connects government and companies and professionals together to create solutions, to create actually alternatives, and to decrease the vendor dependency in the IT infrastructure area, and also to increase the use of open source and to coordinate activities. So what's next? What can we do? What can you do really to support this drive towards digital sovereignty, to really implement and to make next steps? First of all, I think it's important to really look at specific alternatives. There's no use in actually complaining that we are dependent and that we are European government and we cannot do anything. It's really our mission and possibility to find solutions by looking at alternatives. So I suggest to start pilot projects, look at open source program offices, do coordination, and increase also visibility of alternatives. In this story at the Bern University of Applied Sciences, we describe different activities that are going on and which we recommend also to implement. So, for example, the CERN, the nuclear research center in Geneva, they actually started the open source program office, the OSPO in CERN, which actually coordinates the internal development and release of open source software. It actually addresses technical questions, but also legal issues and also community building issues. So actually creating open source program offices in institutions, in government institutions, but also in the private sector makes much sense in order to coordinate all activities all around open source software. Second, I suggest that you coordinate activities. In Switzerland, we have the association CH Open, and this is a non-profit organization, association which actually consists of voluntary actors, but they actually meet in order to support the use and also coordinate the activities all around open source software. We have a long list of trainings, of events, of conferences, which we organize and in order to connect people in Switzerland and also with other countries. So I suggest really to connect and participate, become member in national and local communities and to coordinate activities. And finally, we need to make it visible. We need to make it visible where open source is being used. And this is a platform, Open Source Directory, we built recently in order to show the huge possibilities and the huge also availability of open source alternatives. So it is actually a directory consisting of news all around open source software, consolidation of different news feeds, but also has a list of vendors which contribute and which actually offer professional services all around open source solutions. Then there's a list of clients, so organizations, companies, governments which use open source software. There are products, the open source projects, hundreds and thousands of products which actually are being used in open source context. There are success stories explaining how open source is being actually implemented within certain practical environments. And there is knowledge base, research papers, for example, and there's a list of events, communities, and jobs. So it's a huge possibility to make all things around open source visible and thus increase digital sovereignty. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward for questions and answers.